It was a cold, overcast morning when Richard Hawthorne stood alone in front of the gravestone of his only son, Daniel. The millionaire entrepreneur, a man who had built his wealth from nothing, had known success in every way possible. Yet, in that moment, none of that mattered. The luxurious cars, the sprawling estates, the private jets, none of it could fill the enormous emptiness he felt inside. The world around him had stopped when Daniel, the joy of his life, was tragically taken away. The pain of his loss was something no amount of money could ease. Standing there, Richard felt the weight of grief pressing on his chest like 1,000 tons. He had been to this grave countless times since the day of the accident, but each visit only seemed to make the void inside him grow larger. Richard was a man who had lived for achievement. Whether it was negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, expanding his business empire, or acquiring luxury properties around the world, he had always been a man of action. But nothing prepared him for the loss of his son. Daniel had been just 21 years old when his life was stolen from him in a senseless accident. A simple mistake, a wrong turn on the road, and Daniel was gone. The hole in Richard's heart was beyond repair. His wife, Caroline, had left him too. Unable to cope with the unbearable pain, Richard often found himself wondering why, despite having everything a person could want, he still felt as though his world was falling apart. On that particular morning, as he stood in the cemetery with the wind howling around him, Richard's thoughts were interrupted by something strange. He looked down at Daniel's gravestone, the same one he had stood over countless times before. There was something different about it today. The letters on the stone, once crisp and perfectly engraved, now appeared to be fading, almost as though they were being erased before his very eyes. He rubbed his eyes, thinking maybe the grief was playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, it was unmistakable. There was no doubt about it. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. The name of his son, the date of birth, the date of his death, all were slowly but surely disappearing. As Richard's heart began to race, he dropped to his knees in shock. "This can't be real," he whispered to himself. But it was. The engraving was vanishing, fading away as if it had never been there. Richard looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a tree and tell him it was some kind of sick joke. But there was no one, just the wind and the lonely cemetery. In a daze, Richard pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands trembling as he tried to snap a picture. The camera on his phone couldn't capture the strange phenomenon either. The screen flashed a message that read, "Error, cannot detect the image." It was as if the very essence of his son's memory was being erased, as if the universe itself was trying to erase Daniel from existence. It didn't make sense. How could something like this happen? How could the world forget his son so easily? Richard's mind raced. Could it be a glitch, a bizarre coincidence? He needed answers. His thoughts immediately turned to the strange events that had begun happening around him ever since Daniel's death. Little things at first, an old family photo that had inexplicably disappeared from his desk, a voicemail from Daniel that seemed to play itself on his phone despite the fact that his son was long gone. But this was different. This was something far beyond anything Richard could explain. As his mind swirled with questions, his eyes fell on something at the base of the gravestone, a small folded piece of paper, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately. Richard hesitated for a moment before picking it up. His fingers shook as he unfolded it. On the paper was a single sentence, written in an unfamiliar handwriting. "You have no idea what you've stumbled upon." The words sent a chill down Richard's spine. He looked around again, scanning the graveyard for any sign of someone who might have left it there. But once again, he was alone. The wind howled through the trees, and the distant sound of birds cawing only added to the eerie atmosphere. Richard's pulse quickened as he wondered, who wrote this? And what did it mean? As he stood there, the feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger. His son's grave was not just a place of mourning for him. It was now the center of an unfolding mystery that Richard couldn't ignore. What had happened to his son? Why was the gravestone disappearing? And why had someone left him that cryptic note? Richard's mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. Could there be some kind of hidden truth behind Daniel's death? What if everything he thought he knew about the accident was a lie? What if someone was trying to tell him something that could change everything he believed about his son's life and death? In that moment, Richard knew that his life would never be the same. He could no longer simply stand by and accept that his son was gone. There was something deeper at play, something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. And as he stood alone in that cemetery, staring at the fading gravestone, Richard made a vow to uncover the truth. Whatever it took, he would find the answers. But what he didn't know was that this journey would lead him down a path so dark and twisted that it would challenge everything he thought he understood about the world and the very nature of life and death itself. As he turned to leave the graveyard, a sudden gust of wind picked up, almost as if pushing him towards something. Richard hesitated for a moment, then noticed something strange near the far corner of the cemetery. A shadowy figure seemed to be watching him from the distance. He couldn't make out their face, but the figure's presence was enough to send a wave of unease through his body. Was this someone else who knew about the mystery unfolding around his son's grave? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone who could hold the answers to the questions that haunted him? Richard's heart raced again as he took one last glance at Daniel's gravestone, now nearly completely blank, as if erased from existence. The mystery was just beginning, and Richard was about to uncover something that would change his life forever. But would he be ready for what he was about to discover? Only time would tell. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as the shadowy figure in the distance seemed to grow larger, its outline becoming more distinct with each passing second. His first instinct was to run, to escape the unsettling feeling that had settled in the pit of his stomach. But something held him there. Maybe it was the mystery of his son's grave, or the note that still trembled in his hand. Whatever it was, Richard knew he couldn't walk away from this. Not now. As he cautiously stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the figure, memories of Daniel flooded his mind. Daniel had always been his rock, the one person who understood him. As a child, Daniel had shown a brilliance that was hard to ignore, quick to pick up on business strategies, creative in ways Richard hadn't anticipated, and always so full of life. The two of them had been closer than most fathers and sons. Richard had been so proud of the young man Daniel had become, and he had expected him to eventually take over the family business. But now, as Richard walked toward the figure, those dreams felt like distant whispers, drifting further and further away. The figure finally stepped forward, and Richard froze, his breath caught in his throat. It was a man, tall and lean, with a shadowed face. His eyes were hidden beneath a hood, but there was something about him that felt unnervingly familiar. The air grew thick with tension as the man took slow, deliberate steps toward Richard, stopping just a few feet away. "Who are you?" Richard's voice cracked, betraying the anxiety he was struggling to suppress. The man didn't respond at first. Instead, he slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old worn photograph. He handed it to Richard without saying a word. Richard took the photograph, his hands shaking. It was an image of him and Daniel, taken years ago at a family gathering. They were smiling, laughing, unaware of the storm that would eventually tear their lives apart. But as Richard studied the photo, something caught his eye. A figure standing just behind Daniel, partially hidden in the background. The figure was obscured, but there was no mistaking the shape of the person in the photo. The man's eyes widened in shock. It was the same figure standing before him now. The man spoke, his voice low and raspy. "You have no idea what you're involved in, do you, Richard?" Richard's mind raced. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice steady, despite the rising panic inside him. "Who are you? What do you know about Daniel?" The man's eyes flickered to the gravestone behind Richard. "It's not what you think," he said, his tone grave. "Daniel's death wasn't an accident. It was a warning. And you're in danger now too." Richard's heart skipped a beat. "A warning? From who? What are you saying?" His voice was barely above a whisper, as if he couldn't quite believe the words coming from the stranger's mouth. The man looked over his shoulder, then leaned in closer to Richard, his breath cold against Richard's ear. "There's something dark at play here. Something far bigger than you or me. Your son got caught up in something he wasn't supposed to know about. And now they're coming for you." Richard felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Who's coming for? Me?" he asked, his voice cracking. The man stepped back, raising his hood slightly, revealing just enough of his face for Richard to see the sharpness of his features. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Richard's with an intensity that made Richard's blood run cold. "I'm someone who's seen what's been happening. I've watched it unfold, and I'm here to warn you before it's too late." The man hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "There are powerful people involved in this, Richard. People who can erase entire lives from existence. People who control everything. And if they want something, or someone gone, they can make it happen without a trace." Richard's mind spun. "But why Daniel? Why my son?" The man's gaze softened, just for a moment. Daniel was never supposed to find out. He got too close to the truth, and that truth was worth more than his life. They don't care who they have to eliminate to protect their secrets. Richard clenched his fists, his jaw tightening, with a mix of anger and disbelief. "This doesn't make sense. My son, he wasn't involved in anything dangerous. He was just a young man, trying to find his way. He couldn't have been a threat to anyone." The man's expression darkened. "That's where you're wrong, Richard. Daniel was smarter than you realize. He uncovered something buried deep in your family's past. And now they're after you, because you're the last one standing. You're the only one who can stop them." Richard's mind raced as he tried to piece together what the man was saying. Could it be true? Had Daniel truly discovered something so dangerous that it had cost him his life? He had always suspected there was more to Daniel's death than a simple accident, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. "I don't understand," Richard said, shaking his head. "What do you want from me?" The man's eyes gleamed with a mixture of pity and resolve. "I'm here to help you, Richard, but you have to trust me. You need to find out the truth, no matter where it leads you. Because if you don't, you'll be next." Richard felt a lump in his throat. His thoughts were scattered, the weight of what was being said pressing down on him like a physical force. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was terrifying. As the man turned and began to walk away, he paused and glanced back at Richard, a final warning in his eyes. "Time is running out," Richard stood frozen, the words echoing in his mind. He had lost his son, but now it seemed his battle was just beginning. There were forces at play that he couldn't comprehend. and the stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. The truth was out there, but would he be able to uncover it in time to save himself? Or would he too become just another casualty in a game that had already claimed his son's life? As the man disappeared into the shadows, Richard felt the weight of the mystery settle on his shoulders. He couldn't let his son's death be in vain, but the question lingered. Was he prepared for the truth that lay ahead? Only time would tell. Richard spent the next few days in a fog, his mind still reeling from the cryptic warning the man had given him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger than he could understand was happening, something far, darker and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel's face, and every time he opened them, he saw the faded gravestone, the name disappearing as if erasing the very essence of his son's existence. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Richard knew he had to find the truth, whatever it was. But where to start? The more he thought about the man's words, the more he realized that Daniel must have stumbled upon something, a hidden secret that had cost him his life. And if it wasn't for that small faded photograph the man had handed him, Richard might have given up, resigned to the tragedy. But now he couldn't stop. He had to finish what Daniel had started. Richard revisited the family estate, hoping to find some clues, anything that would help him understand what had happened. The house had always been a symbol of his success, sprawling, beautiful, and filled with memories of better times. But now, as he wandered through the halls, it felt like a mausoleum. He passed rooms that once held laughter and warmth, now empty, their silence suffocating. As he reached the study, Richard froze. On the desk, an envelope lay in plain view. It was unmarked, with only a faint handwritten word scribbled across. The front, Daniel. His heart skipped a beat as he carefully opened it, his hands trembling. Inside was a letter, one that Daniel had written, but never sent. Richard's eyes scanned the words, each one like a revelation, a piece of the puzzle finally falling into place. Dad, if you're reading this, it means something's happened to me. I've discovered something I shouldn't have. I don't know who they are, but they'll stop at nothing to protect what's hidden. It's connected to the company, to the family's wealth, and to people whose names you don't even recognize. They'll do whatever it takes to keep it all in the dark. If something happens to me, find the truth. Richard felt his chest tighten as the weight of his son's words hit him. Daniel had known too much. Richard's entire life, everything he had worked for, was built on a secret that had been buried for years. Daniel had uncovered it, and that's why he was gone. The realization shook Richard to his core. The stakes had never been higher, but Richard wasn't backing down. He couldn't. He had to face whatever it was that had led to his son's death, no matter the cost. He followed the trail Daniel had left behind, piecing together the fragments of his son's discoveries. Each new clue took him deeper into a world of shadowy figures and corporate corruption, people who had manipulated the very foundation of his family's wealth. It was all connected to an illegal deal made decades ago, a deal that had been hidden away, sealed by threats and violence. And now someone powerful, was making sure no one could expose it. Richard knew who he had to confront. There was one name, one person who seemed to have a hand in everything. The same person who had orchestrated the dark side of the business. A powerful figure in the shadows. Someone who had been pulling the strings for years. Richard knew this final confrontation was coming, and he couldn't escape it. The night was Richard's only ally as he made his way to the private estate of the person who had been behind it all. The mansion loomed in the distance, its lights flickering in the night as if it too sensed the tension in the air. Richard's heart raced. He had to end this, once and for all. As he approached the door, he noticed a figure standing in the shadows. Familiar, yet chilling. It was the man who had warned him in the cemetery. "You're too late," the man said, his voice cold. "You're already in too deep. I'm not backing down." Richard shot back, his resolve unshakable. "You know what happened to my son? Tell me the truth." The man's gaze softened, and for the first time, Richard saw a flicker of regret. "I never wanted you to be involved in this, but now you've made your choice. You're right to be here. It's the only way to stop them." Before Richard could respond, the mansion door creaked open, revealing the mastermind behind it all, a man he knew well, someone he had trusted. It was Thomas Carter, his closest business associate, the man who had helped build his empire, the very man Richard never thought could be involved in such darkness. Thomas's smile was cold, almost predatory, as he stepped forward. "You were never meant to find out, Richard," Thomas said, his voice smooth but laced with malice. "Daniel was too much of a risk, and now you've come too close to the truth. You're making a mistake." The air between them crackled with tension, and for the first time in years, Richard felt the weight of betrayal, like a physical force. Thomas had been the one pulling the strings all along, manipulating everything for his own gain. He had used Richard's trust to hide a criminal empire that stretched far beyond anything Richard could have imagined, and Daniel had uncovered it. But Richard had come too far. He couldn't stop now. The man who had once been his partner now stood before him as the architect of his son's death. "I won't let you get away with this," Richard said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "You're going to pay for what you did." The confrontation was intense, but Richard didn't hesitate. With the help of the mysterious man, who revealed himself as a former ally to Daniel's secret investigation, Richard exposed the full extent of Thomas's crimes. The evidence was undeniable, and as the authorities closed in, Thomas's empire began to crumble. The truth had finally come to light. In the end, Richard was left standing in the ruins of everything he had known. The loss of Daniel was something he would never fully recover from, but he had honored his son's legacy. He had uncovered the truth, and in doing so, he had avenged his death. As Richard looked out over the horizon, he knew that no amount of wealth or power could ever replace what he had lost. But he also knew that for the first time in a long time, he was free. The dark shadow had lifted, and though the pain of his son's absence would never fade, Richard could finally breathe again. The truth had set him free, and it was the only thing that had mattered all along.